Lady Boulay, and I hope you're having a wonderful day. Thank you for your support. Thank you for subscribing to the channel. Thank you for your thumbs up, for your comments, and thank you for sharing the videos. Thank you for all you do to support the channel. And yes, we are commanded to love one another, whether we want to or not, or whether we agree with each other or not. And today I'm going to talk about why Black Americans stopped voting Republican. We began coming out of slavery as Republicans. The Republican Party was formed as an anti-slavery party. Now somebody came in my comment section and said, well, it began as an industrial, some kind of nonsense. All of it was to end slavery. So you can shake it out, shake it up, shake it down, any way you want to. They wanted to end slavery. And this country was becoming industrialized. That is true. And the North wanted to incorporate the industry in the South. Now remember, the wealth of the country was in the South, not in the North. It was in the South, built on the agricultural system. And that meant pure, free labor done by the enslaved people. So the North had taken advantage of the enslaved people. They had had slavery too, but they didn't have cotton. They didn't have the land that was conducive for growing these big crops. So they wanted manufacturing, and they wanted to end slavery, pull the wealth out of the South, and incorporate the industrial system in which the Industrial Revolution had begun. But back to the point, the Republican Party brought about the end of slavery. And sometimes, y'all, I'm just going to get out the message for 1 minute. Especially white people and black people who think like white people always want to make it clear that it wasn't because the Republicans cared about black people. Black people didn't care about them either. Black people wanted the system of slavery to end, regardless to who brought it to an end. They wanted it to end by any means necessary. You don't have to come into my comment section telling me that the people of the North of the Republican Party didn't care about black people, or that Abraham Lincoln didn't care about black people. Black people didn't care about them either. Black people cared about freedom, and freedom came from the Republican Party. And not only freedom, but look at this. This chart tells you how members of Congress voted on the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. These amendments had strictly to do with the formerly enslaved people. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery. 100% of Republicans in Congress voted to abolish slavery. Only 23% of Democrats voted to abolish slavery. The 14th Amendment gave them citizenship and equal protection under the law. 94% of Republicans voted for the 14th Amendment. 0% of Democrats voted for the 14th Amendment. The 15th Amendment gave the black men right to vote. 100% of Republicans voted for black men to have the right to vote. 0% of Democrats voted for black men to have the right to vote. So coming out of slavery, the Republican Party passed these 3 amendments which impacted their lives and continue to impact our lives. The Republican Party voted to end slavery, to give the formerly enslaved citizenship and equal protection under the law, and it gave black men the right to vote. In 1870, the 15th Amendment was passed. So from 1870 until about 1965, black Americans were loyal and staunch Republicans. And this is why. That is also why the first black members of Congress were Republicans. Booker T. Washington, who was the most influential black man in America in his lifetime, was a Republican. And everybody else was too. It was automatic. Black Americans voted Republican. So, what happened? Why did black people stop voting Republican? Like everything in America, it was about politics. Remember, the South during slavery was Democratic. Those old plantation owners were Democrats. They were staunchly against the Civil Rights Bill. They were staunchly against any kind of progress for black people. So coming out of slavery, many of the black people hit the ground running. A lot of businesses were established, colleges were established. Black people were becoming on a par to be equal to white people in spite of the fact that they had been enslaved for so long. So the South, those old Southern plantation owners, and even the poor whites, they had not gotten over the fact that they had lost the Civil War. The enslaved people were operating on their own, and they were starting to really become American citizens. This angered those Southern white people. It really is as simple as that. The Jim Crow laws lasted from 1877 until 1964. These laws segregated Americans, black and white, lawfully. And they also restricted black people's education, employment, transportation, health care, everything. But in spite of that, black people were still making some progress because, as I have said before, we are resilient people. But white people still resented the progress we were making, even though we were handicapped legally by those laws. This is the electoral map for 1960. Richard Nixon up there in the orange and John Kennedy down here in the blue. Nixon was a Republican and Kennedy was a Democrat. So you can see all of this blue down here in the South. This represents votes for John Kennedy, the Democrat. John Kennedy won that contest between himself and Richard Nixon. So the Democrats won the election in 1960. What's important to note is that these southern states have a lot of electoral votes. Out west, the states are larger, but they don't have a large population. So the population is where the votes are. So the South had more electoral votes. So the Republican Party came up with something they called the Southern Strategy. And this was no more than a strategy to increase their political support among Southern white people by appealing to their racism against black people. Southern white people were mad about the Civil Rights Act being passed. They were mad about school integration. They were mad about busing. They were mad about black people now being able to be hired at jobs that had discriminated against black people. So the Republicans began preying on their fears of black people. So the Southern Strategy said, we're going to alienate black people and bring the white people into the Republican Party who had been before in the Democratic Party. So that's what the Southern Strategy was. These two men right here, Richard Nixon on the left and Barry Goldwater on the right, were the leaders of the Southern Strategy. Richard Nixon had been defeated by the Democrat John Kennedy in 1960, and Barry Goldwater was defeated by Lyndon Johnson in 1964 because the South, the Southern white people, were still voting Democratic. But they began the Southern strategy after the 1964 election, started talking about how black people were getting handouts for welfare and how black men were criminals and all of these negative things that they say about black people now. Those things began in 1964. And they also began this whole thing about black people being lazy, didn't want to work, because now black people didn't have to go to their house and work for $2 a day. Black people could go to factories and get jobs in factories just like they could. And they resented that. So rather than just admit they were upset because black people were competing with them for jobs, they told lies and said black people didn't want to work. So all of this negativity coming from the Republicans gave white people, or justified white people's anger and hatred towards black people. So they started voting. Gradually, white people drifted to the Republican Party and began voting for Republican candidates. So this was the electoral map for 1960 and about 1964. White people voting Democratic and the Democrats winning. But in 1964, the Republicans began their propaganda war against the Democrats and against black people. This is the electoral map for 1968. Richard Nixon, who had lost to this map in 1960, won in 1968. He won all of the southern states except Texas. The Southern strategy said that if they could win the white Southerners, they didn't need the black Southerners. So they sacrificed the black Southerners to get the white Southerners to win by stoking the anger of white people against black people, making the white people believe that black people were taking something away from them and getting something that they weren't getting. And they still believe that. So black people were really driven away from the Republican Party. They made it clear to black people, especially in 1964 when Barry Goldwater was running, that they didn't need black people in the Republican Party, because they know as long as they play on white people's anger and hatred against black people, that is a winning strategy. And that is why black Americans stopped voting Republican, because the Republican Party decided they did not need black people to win. So black people drifted to the Democratic Party, and that's where we have been for about the last 60 years. And it goes without saying that there's no need for black people to fall in love with either one of these parties. We need to become a swing voting bloc, voting only for the party that considers our interests. Okay, so there you have it. Thank you for listening. Subscribe to the channel, give me a thumbs up, leave a comment, share the video. And as always, have a great day.